Imagine sitting in a prison cell, facing nearly 2 years behind bars, and you refuse to give up your innocence so fiercely that you actually write a 20,000-word legal defense. And you write it in your own blood.
Yeah, it's an incredibly intense image.
It really is. Welcome to today's Deep Dive. We're looking at a highly specific real-world scenario today. It's the case of Dr. Jingyuan Chen. And this is really a story about what happens when an unstoppable force of institutional power just, collides head-on with a scientifically trained, fiercely independent mind.
Right, and I think it's important to state up front that our mission today isn't to take political sides or weigh in on the ideology here.
Exactly. We are looking at this purely as a massive real-time psychological specimen. We've got a stack of psychological analyses and AI evaluations, and we're just going to unpack the human behavior at play.
Because the documents detailing this case, they present this staggering cognitive gap. Just to ground you in the facts here, Dr. Chen is an independent scholar with a PhD, and he was sentenced to 1 year and 8 months in prison. The official charge was picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Which sounds broad, but when you look at the actual offense that triggered it, it's almost mundane. He basically used a VPN to forward a small number of Twitter posts.
Yeah, and these weren't like radical manifestos or anything. They were a mix of topics covering art, history, some political theory, and emotion.
Just general academic curation.
Mm-hmm.
But the judicial system argued that because of his advanced education, his PhD, he should have known that the information in those specific posts was false.
Right, they took it a step further. They claimed that by forwarding these posts, he actually caused severe social disorder.
Which brings us back to that 20,000-word defense written in blood. He completely rejected their premise. He didn't just say, I'm innocent. He turned his whole trial into this battle of epistemologies.
He really did. And to understand how two groups of people can look at the exact same set of facts and arrive at two completely incompatible realities, we have to look at how they literally process information.
Okay, let's unpack that.
We're talking about a textbook clash of cognitive processing. The analysis of this case maps perfectly onto psychologist Daniel Kahneman's framework. System 1 and System 2 thinking.
Oh, right, the fast and slow thinking model.
Exactly. Dr. Chen operates almost exclusively in System 2 when it comes to his work. This is the slow, deliberate, highly analytical part of the brain. He approaches the world with what psychologists call epistemic humility.
Meaning he inherently understands the limits of his own knowledge, right? Like, he knows what he doesn't know.
Yes. He views information as a spectrum of probabilities, not just black and white certainties. So when he was accused of causing social disorder, his defense wasn't some emotional plea.
Yeah.
He actually cited Gödel's incompleteness theorem and complex systems theory. He tried to mathematically map out causality for the court.
Which is wild to do in a legal defense.
It is. He was arguing that a minor isolated node in a massive network, meaning his small social media account, cannot logically trigger a system-wide collapse.
So he's basically pointing out that society is like an ocean. If you drop, like, a single drop of food coloring into the Pacific Ocean, it mathematically cannot turn the whole sea red.
Exactly.
The ocean is too vast and the drop is too small. So it's kind of like a chess grandmaster trying to explain a 10-move sequence to someone who is strictly playing checkers.
That is the perfect analogy, because the judicial system was operating heavily in System 1. This is our fast, intuitive, heuristic-driven brain.
And heuristics are just mental shortcuts.
Right. And in high-stakes institutional environments, workers often develop a severe, high need for cognitive closure. They are confronted with this messy, ambiguous situation, a scholar forwarding abstract theories on a foreign platform.
Yeah.
And their environment demands a fast, definitive answer to just eliminate that ambiguity.
But wait, I'm struggling with this a bit. Because we all use mental shortcuts, Like, if I see dark clouds, I grab an umbrella. I don't calculate the barometric pressure.
Sure, yeah.
So if these are highly educated legal professionals, how do they look at a scholar collecting data and instantly jump to the conclusion that he's a malicious actor trying to destroy society? Why is that shortcut so dangerous here?
It comes down to how those mental shortcuts warp reality under intense pressure. One of the most destructive heuristics at play here is the fundamental attribution error.
Okay, what is that exactly?
This happens when you attribute someone's behavior to a fixed internal personality trait while completely ignoring the situational context.
Oh, wow.
So the system looked at Dr. Chen and concluded, he has a PhD, so he is smart. Therefore, he must be intentionally spreading rumors to cause harm.
So they completely bypass the context. The fact that his lifelong habit, his actual profession, is to collect and analyze diverse research materials regardless of whether he personally endorses them.
Exactly. Once that label of malicious actor is slapped on, confirmation bias just locks the door.
Right.
The system processes his complex academic curiosity as a simple, binary, true or false crime. They filter out any evidence showing he's just a researcher.
And they only accept evidence that confirms the troublemaker label,
Yeah.
which completely short-circuits that slow, deliberate System 2 analysis that a fair judicial process actually requires.
Precisely.
Okay, but if their mental shortcuts are that rigid, how does that translate into the actual mechanics of a trial? Because it's one thing to have a biased thought, but it's another to literally lock someone in a cell.
Well, if their cognitive processing was completely different, we have to look at how that translated into their actual behavior. We move from how they think to how they act.
Okay,
And we do this using the behavioral psychology SRC model. That stands for stimulus, response, and consequence. Behavior is largely driven by the consequences that follow it.
right, basic behavioral conditioning.
Yeah. And the behavioral data in this specific case reveals a massive, glaring contradiction.
And this is the part that honestly completely threw me when I was looking at the sources, because the system claimed he caused severe social disorder.
Okay.
But Chen had like fewer than 100 followers. And more importantly, his posts had virtually zero engagement. We're talking 0 likes, 0 retweets, 0 comments. I mean, was there some phantom metric they used, or was it entirely fabricated?
From a purely behavioral standpoint, the claim of social disorder is biologically and mechanically impossible here.
Wait, impossible.
Yes. If a behavior in this case, forwarding a post, receives absolutely zero reinforcement from the environment, it extinguishes.
Oh, I see.
If no one likes it, shares it, or models it, the behavioral chain breaks at the very first link. It is the equivalent of talking to an empty room. You cannot incite a riot if there is no one in the room to hear you.
Right, so if the math of the crime is that obviously flawed, what is fueling these judges and prosecutors to aggressively pursue this case? Because I refuse to believe an entire room of legal experts just suddenly forgot how basic cause and effect works.
They didn't forget. Their behavior was essentially hijacked by their environment. Behavioral psychology helps us see that the judicial workers are trapped in this institutional reinforcement matrix.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Specifically, they're in a workplace driven by negative reinforcement. In many rigid institutions, workers are punished, through career reprimands, demotions, intense scrutiny if they cause procedural delays, or if they fail to neutralize a perceived threat.
Oh, wow. So you're saying the judicial workers are just responding to their own set of psychological rewards and punishments, like Pavlov's dogs, but with career incentives.
That's exactly it. They avoid this punishment by delivering fast, definitive conclusions that align with what they believe the institution wants. Their behavior is a highly adaptive response to their specific environment.
They're frantically pressing the convict button to avoid getting shocked by their own bosses.
Right. But the ultimate behavioral tragedy of this case is how the system tried to control Dr. Chen himself.
How so?
The institution attempted to use positive punishment, which in behavioral terms means introducing a severe negative consequence, like prison time, to stop his behavior and force a confession. But it failed spectacularly.
Because it didn't break him. I mean, it resulted in a 20,000-word academic paper written in blood. So why was he so immune to a punishment that would honestly shatter most people?
Because the system completely miscalculated his motivation. They assumed his behavior was driven by external rewards, like social clout or, political disruption.
Right.
But Chen's behavior was intrinsically motivated. He was driven by a fundamental search for knowledge and his own scientific truth.
Oh, I see.
When a behavior is its own reward, it becomes highly resistant to extinction. You can lock up the physical body, but you cannot easily extinguish intrinsic motivation.
That makes a lot of sense. But still, institutional rewards alone don't fully explain how an entire system of people can sleep at night after locking a man up over 0 engagement tweets.
No, they don't.
If you're listening to this and wondering how human beings justify this to themselves, you really have to understand the cultural water they're swimming in.
Absolutely. We have to zoom out to the broader social and cultural dynamics. This scenario is playing out in what anthropologists call a high-power distance culture.
High power distance. Okay.
Yeah. In these environments, authority and hierarchy dictate truth. Think of the classic Milgram obedience experiments mentioned in the text.
Right, where people administered shocks just because a guy in a lab coat told them to.
Exactly. In a high-power distance system, questioning the logic of an authority figure isn't just seen as like a procedural disagreement, it is culturally coded as disloyalty or betrayal.
Which creates an environment where everyone is terrified to be the one person who points out that the emperor has no clothes. Or, in this case, that the tweet has 0 likes.
Right. And this leads directly to a phenomenon called groupthink and moral disengagement. This is how good, otherwise rational people can participate in systems that do deeply harmful things.
How do they rationalize it?
The individuals diffuse their personal responsibility. They mentally sanitize their actions by telling themselves, I don't make the laws, I'm just following orders. Or they say, I'm protecting the broader stability of society.
So by using these euphemisms, they preserve their self-image as good people while actively participating in crushing an individual.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to Dr. Chen himself. Facing the crushing weight of a high-power distance culture where the entire apparatus of the state is telling you that you are a criminal. I mean, a lot of people would just fold.
Most people would.
They would internalize the label, they'd fall into learned helplessness, or maybe develop severe PTSD. They'd sign a confession just to make the pressure stop. So how did Chen process this trauma without completely losing his mind?
He utilized a profound psychological defense mechanism. Through the lens of clinical and cultural psychology, this is called cognitive reappraisal and meaning-making.
Meaning-making.
Yep.
So how did that look in practice?
He essentially engaged in sublimation. He took an overwhelming traumatic experience, the terror, the isolation, and channeled it into a higher intellectually valuable act.
So instead of falling into despair, he picked up a pen. Or, well, he used his own blood.
Right. He categorically refused to accept the label of criminal. He rigidified his identity as an independent scholar. Writing that rigorous defense in his blood was his way of turning a traumatic, isolating experience into a hero's journey.
Oh, wow.
He essentially turned his prison cell into an academic symposium where he was still the keynote speaker. It was a psychological mechanism to maintain his sanity and his self-worth when the physical world had stripped him of everything else.
He used his intellect as a shield. He just refused to let them rewrite his identity.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've walked through how human bias, workplace conditioning, and cultural obedience totally warped the reality of this case. But this deep dive doesn't stop there, because the sources pose this fascinating question. What if we strip away the fear of the boss? What if we remove all that cultural baggage and the need for cognitive closure? What happens when you feed the exact same legal facts to artificial intelligence? You know, the ultimate objective observers.
This is where the analysis takes a really fascinating meta-turn. A meta-analysis was conducted using 6 different large language models.
And these are the big ones, right?
Yeah, we're talking ChatGPT, Copilot, Grok, Qwen, Gemini, and DeepSeek. They were all given the legal and logical facts of the exact same case to evaluate the prosecution's logic.
And the consensus is stunning. I was amazed by this. Every single one of those models instantly agreed on the core flaw. They all looked at the empirical data, the fewer than 100 followers, the 0 engagement, and objectively concluded there was a total lack of empirical evidence for severe social disorder.
Because AI fundamentally lacks the human biases we've been discussing. It doesn't care about looking disloyal to a boss.
Right, it just runs the numbers.
Exactly. And the models provided some incredibly sharp insights by just looking at the structural logic. For instance, Gemini approached the case through the lens of complex systems theory, which actually validated Dr. Chen's own defense.
Wait, really? How so?
Gemini pointed out that a massive modern society has high robustness.
And robustness meaning like the system's ability to absorb shocks without falling apart.
Correct. Gemini noted that a massive society is far too robust to be thrown into chaos by a low-frequency, zero-engagement tweet. The AI basically categorized the tweet as mere system noise.
System noise.
Yeah. To claim that this system noise caused severe social disorder is a massive failure to understand the scale of the society itself.
It goes right back to that food coloring in the ocean analogy. The AI is doing the math and saying, the ocean didn't change color. Your premise is flawed.
Exactly.
And I was particularly blown away by DeepSeek's analysis in the sources. DeepSeek didn't just look at the theory, it looked at the timeline as a natural experiment.
Yes. DeepSeek highlighted a brilliant logical paradox. Think about it. Dr. Chen was arrested, he went to prison, and he served his time.
Right.
During all of that time, those specific social media posts still existed on the internet. And they still had zero engagement. No one cared.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think of that.
DeepSeek pointed out that this real-world natural experiment completely empirically disproved the judicial system's predictive conviction. The system predicted chaos. The posts remained active, but the chaos never arrived.
It is staggering. It's just amazing to realize that these AI models, completely free from a high need for cognitive closure or institutional fear, can instantly spot the missing causal links that a room full of highly educated human experts somehow missed.
Or more accurately, we're psychologically incentivized to ignore. It perfectly illustrates how blinding human bias can be when it is baked into the architecture of an institution.
Wow. As we look back at the journey we've just taken, it's wild to see how many layers of human flaw are stacked on top of each other here. We tracked a single legal case through the rigid heuristics of human cognition.
Yeah.
We saw the invisible strings of behavioral reinforcement making people act out of self-preservation. We felt the heavy weight of cultural obedience. And finally, we saw the cold, clear logic of artificial intelligence cutting through it all.
Which is really why Dr. Chen's story isn't just some isolated legal anecdote. It serves as a profound warning about epistemic arrogance.
Epistemic arrogance.
Yes, that is the immense danger of institutional systems that lack the metacognition, the self-awareness to realize their own biases. When an institution uses its power to flatten complex reality into simple binary labels just to protect its own ego, it ceases to be a system of justice. It just becomes a machine for enforcing conformity.
Which makes Dr. Chen's survival all the more incredible, but it also exposes how fragile our institutions really are.
Absolutely.
We all operate within systems, our workplaces, our communities, our social circles. They all have their own unwritten rules, their own reward structures for falling in line, and their own massive blind spots. So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
If an AI were to audit the ironclad decisions that you or your organization made this week, what would it find? Would it uncover a carefully reasoned System 2 process? Or would it just find a bunch of institutional biases masquerading as objective truth? Something to think about. Until next time.